that it's really important to fail because you learn from that failing. And I was just having a conversation with someone today that that's so important to be willing to fail, and that's where I would be, learning more about the topic.
Great. Mo, were you going to say something? Nope. No, I appreciate that, Beth. And at the end of our conversation in the small group, one of the things that we were discussing is like, in traditional design thinking concepts, especially out of technology, there is an assumption of a high level of resources to throw all kinds of things at the wall. So the tension for us is to live with a level of, I think we need to introduce more grace into our own practices and not-for-profit leadership and in religious leadership and in other settings, more comfort level with failure, right? And it's hard in part because, again, we're either dealing with the lives of people, the sense of urgency of social issues, or what we and our communities believe to be sacred and important. And so it's hard to introduce into that any level of sort of flexibility, but that's in part, is really rooting that in a spiritual practice of allowing that. And on the other hand, just the recognition of those limits that are real, like the number of permutations and the resources available are going to be different. So part, I think, of our effort in developing this as a course for ourselves, and then in thinking about our work in our communities, is what are other models of creativity and innovation and ingenuity within communities that don't have a lot of resources, right? The concept of a minimal viable product is valuable, right? Because you're doing, and I'm now thinking of the two texts that we were using and thinking about both, Moses was definitely a minimal viable product, and so was Jesus as an infant, right? Was the very, very beginning idea that might germinate, so. So we have two more topics to land our way through, and so you want to introduce us to those,
Right. So the last formal step of the traditional 5-step process is testing. Once you've made your prototype, you've got to put it out in some part of the world where you can get other reflections of experience back at you to understand how that prototype is landing relative to the intention that you set out for it. And we've added a 6th step that leads into the principle of iteration. The principle you're going to start doing it again is, once you've tested, there's a process of reflection. What did we learn? How do we know what's good? How do we know what's bad? How do we know what we want to keep? How do we know what we're going to reject? So that when we iterate, we can fold all that learning back right from the beginning and do it all over again. So David, just to reflect on testing and iteration.
So I think, in chapel yesterday, Mazan, our community life, director of community life, did a phenomenal sermon on kind of using the I am statements throughout Scripture. So beginning with when Moses is about to go back and try to get the people out of Egypt, his concern was that he needed to convince his own people first about why they would even try this. Like, who do I tell them send me, right? And so the response is this verse or this phrase that in the Hebrew text is the vowels are Yahweh. So or Yahweh is often, or Jehovah is a way in which it sometimes gets transliterated. And that's this affirmation of saying, I am who I am. And this is an agency, right? Is the decision to take an action, to have some agency in what we do, and to define and to begin to move into that testing opportunity to be able to say, this is who I am, right? That this is what I am. That practice of claiming agency and identity and specificity has been denied many communities, right? And it's all very much framed by all kinds of factors of race, of gender, of resources, of all kinds of things. So I think entering again further into that step of testing, then it matters both that we have been intentional about for whom are we deciding this, again, I encourage us to think theologically about who we design things around is really significant, right? And then who gets to provide feedback in the testing of that idea? Who is it? Now, if many of our models, if you think about both not-for-profit education, or not-for-profits, education, many religious communities, the challenge we are facing is that the people who we need to convince are usually the people with the deep pockets, right? Whether it's a foundation, whether it's a large donor. And so there is some risk in trying to figure out who are we going to test this with. And there's some intentionality in being able to make that decision, and in doing that, how we make that selection. In the Latin American church during the period of the 1960s and 70s, if you're familiar with the history of Latin America, there was a period of deep tensions and polarization within Latin America. What has in the Northern Hemisphere was called the Cold War was actually a very hot war in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, where these proxy wars were fought between these two superpowers and these two ideological systems of both capitalism and communism. And so in that tension, the church found itself trying to make a decision about who would be its community of accountability, on whose behalf should the church be working, right? And that's the concept that some of you may be familiar with liberation theology, of a preferential option for the poor. So what the Latin American bishops, Catholic bishops, arrived at is they called on the church to say, we have to rethink the whole church through the lens of the poor. The phrase they use is, we have to walk closer to the poor. The understanding was that the church, the way the buildings were built, what was preached about, the language that was used, which was predominantly Latin, all of these things were organized around a particular part of the community, the elites, and the understanding that that's what needed to organize and understand itself. So as we enter into the idea of testing and actually engage in this moving, there's this, again, grace is throughout, right? We got to dare to do this. We got to try to do this. We have to recognize that there may be alternative ways for us to do this, given the limits of our own communities and their capacities. But we can also have some significant intentionality. We must have it, because without intentionality, the testing, both who we define this around and who gets to provide feedback as to whether it's working or not, it will determine the ultimate choices that we make and the success of what we bring.
Okay, I'm just going to say it. Amen. Because, I've been holding it in all night, David. I can feel the preaching.
You got to go for it.
Yeah, I just got to do that. So, wow. Yeah, no, amen to that. And I put it as question 4 in the questions I sent when we had the thing I just sent earlier today about preferential option for the poor, right? And that is related to a moral framework. We come out of a tradition. For those of us who are explicitly Christian or seeking ordination or whatever it is, we have an entire tradition that gives us a moral framework. It provides a certain kind of accountability, and it tells us that it makes moral demands, right? That we have to think of these people, those people, that people. We have to do that. The widow, the orphan, and stranger, of course, in the Hebrew tradition, and so these are things that we cannot ignore. And so, just so you know that there's you need a moral framework. Does design thinking have a moral framework? That was one of the questions we had talked about a little bit last week. Mm-hmm. That's maybe operative here as well.
Shouldn't that come before the empathy? All of that you said, President, mm-hmm. Because I think that informs who and narrows down the project from the first place. In other words, what do they say? What is the Marxist saying? A methodological failure is a result of an ideological error, right? And so the I am piece comes before, to me, the empathy, because it defines, like Professor Goldberg talked about pedagogy. As I understand pedagogy, and I'm going to use Michael James's definition, Deborah Lee's partner. He defines it as pedagogy is the educational expression of a politics and philosophy. So the pedagogy is not neutral. It's the spirit that shapes the pedagogy, therefore shapes the empathy, therefore shapes all of that in. And so it narrows, you already narrowed down with the statement, I am related, I am concerned about these particular, I empathize. So it's like, it's hard to do liberation pedagogy in a Ku Klux meeting. You know, it's you know, they're not gonna go there because the I am is so limited to who I am and what I can be. And so unless you step into understanding who I am first, it will sort of maybe dictate the empathy of where you go. It doesn't close off, but I'm saying there's a little bit of presumption of a empty, like you know, a blank slate or something like that when it comes to empathy.
Very much.
I'm still wrestling with that anyway.
No, I appreciate that very much, Jeffrey, because I think you know, is the idea that we are very uncomfortable with the concepts of sin in contemporary world, right? If you think about here, you know, the way to hell is paved with good intentions, says the song, right? So there is a gap between what we intend and what actually happens. And in an earlier conversation today, we're talking about the fact that that's where what happens, right, in that gap. Well, people get crushed in it. People get crucified, literally, right? So the ideas within the Christian tradition and with other traditions of redemption is about reconciling ourselves to what is in the world, right, and to some sense of redemption of the world. And that takes a gap. You know, something has to close that wide gap. And you know, whether that's a gap of economic inequality, a gap of gender disparities, a gap of racial, misconceptions, all these things shape the way, and we need to find ways to engage that gap, but it comes at a price. You know, again, we're uncomfortable with both the idea of sin, which requires the recognition that intentions are not good enough, right? That there is brokenness, and if we are blind to that, if we assume we're all just wonderful people and there's a tabla rasa that we're all going to go into and the world is going to be our oyster, even a whiteboard. I mean, so just remember, that's just on the wall, right? At some point, this has to live in the world and it's going to be limited and it's going to have to live within those. But we also have to allow ourselves to experiment, to think beyond it, to be creative so that we can move that a bit further than where it has been. And so that's both the ability to participate in this redemptive task. So both Maggie and Phoebe had their hands up, and Maggie, you want to go first? Or?
Yeah, I just want to really vehemently agree with the point Jeffrey's making, slowly advancing from communities of accountability and identifying that, because, and something I was thinking in the initial conversation on empathy, and indeed in the materials, like way back in spring of 2020, I looked at and prepared for my empathy annotated bibliography. If you haven't done it yet, you will. Was really thinking just like the limits of empathy, both from a praxis sense of empathic overload, but also of the really like the self-harm and the self-punishing that comes with empathizing with those whose ideological or moral position is against your thriving. For the poor and working to empathize with the rich, and owning in their intentions is to deny against their own interests. That might be too abstract. Let me make it undeniably literal. When I, a trans woman, attempt to empathize with the positions of trans misogynists, I end up in a loop of self-destruction and self-loathing, trying to take as respectable the positions of the gender critical, of the parent just concerned about their child, is one that doesn't serve me in the call to do right by my trans femme kin, and of course, generally trans and gender unconforming can. It also harms me in a similar way. Empathizing too well with the trans medicalist position harms both my relationships with my even more gender nonconforming and non-binary friends and loved ones, but also harms me against my own binary breaking. To empathize too well with a position that abhors your existence is harmful and will hobble the mission of justice you hope to bring.
Yeah, and I think so that, again, this is where we move from ideation to particularity, right? Is that fall into existence. So we need to begin to identify what are going to be the limits. There may be financial, there may be, as you're describing very powerfully, Maggie, a matter of what is actually within where can you thrive and where will limit your thriving as an individual, as a community. And that's a tension, and that's an ongoing tension between the particularity of an institution and the harm that can be caused by that. And also the risks that we are running right now. We are living in an increasingly fragmented society, right? And some of that is certainly easily pointed to conservative views that limit, like you're either with us or against us, right? And that's it. And then there's this constant fighting. But there is an atomization towards very particular individual expressions. And so this is the ongoing tension when we are creating for community, for institutions. We need to be mindful of all of those limits, particularly the ones that allow us individually to thrive. So I appreciate that very much. Phoebe.
Well, I want to say that those last two comments were so profound and useful to me, and I'm really grateful to Jeffrey and Maggie for raising them. And Maggie, I've felt that and never heard it articulated so well before. Thank you so much for that. That was really, really powerful. And what I wanted to reflect on was just that in how powerful that is to reflect that in testing, in the testing phase, not just the ideation phase, not just at the beginning of the project, but in the testing phase, that it's not enough to be empathetic. Like that's not actually going to get you what you need as information about whether you are bringing the right thing into the world.
Can I just real quickly add to that? You're absolutely right, Phoebe and Maggie. You point to something very, very powerful. I think you better just hit on a real critique of design thinking. That is to say, is empathy the right word that we want? And maybe as seminary students, we have a larger framework with which we're looking at, a bigger lens with which we're looking at things, as opposed to just trying to empathize. David mentioned sin and brokenness, right? And so there's a kind of egalitarian quality that comes with, being in this world created in flesh with all the limitations and all the contradictions to go all the way through, down, in and out, around, and all over the place. All of us, have that. And so on that level, it's probably the only possibility. And this is a risk. And I'm trying something here. I'm gonna prototype this, so you see if it works. But it might be the only place where you can have, where the Ku Klux Klan member and Jeffrey can be in the same room, and Maggie and you guys can all have a decent conversation. That's probably the only way. And see, that's a moral. That's something beyond, I think, design thinking. I'm just going to pose it as an issue.
I'm going to pick that run up, Leonard, and partly because we need to start bringing this conversation to closure. We've got a lot we got to get to, and I'm being mindful of that. But I do have some thoughts about this last little round of conversation, which is, I agree, very, very powerful. To me, I think the question in the technocratic mind, design is beyond morality. Design is value free. There's just machines. And even the human-centered design frame doesn't get outside of that, because empathy isn't enough. Compassion is really, really important. Loving kindness is important. Agency is really important. They're all important. And if we approach something just with a neutral empathy, we're not getting there. And yes, there is a critique of design thinking that's absolutely necessary. I think a school of theology is exactly the place that needs to take place. And so I think this has been a really rich and amazing start to what I hope will be an ongoing tradition of raising a critique within this class and probably, hopefully, outside of these windows that we're in right now. And
I think it's too, yeah, that's really powerful, Neil. And we appreciate your partnership in precisely creating the space for that kind of conversation. My hope is that out of this class, we will each continue to think about rewriting the book. Stu, did you want to jump in before we close? I want to just leave. It started with a scripture, so I'm going to end with a scripture. I'm a preacher, y'all.
I was just thinking, did you say design thinking was separate from morality entirely? Because I feel like you could then say, oh, well, we're going to design a gun that's a perfect toy for kids. You know, like I think that design thinking has to live in a moral world if we want our world to survive.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just saying the normative frame, the technocratic frame of design thinking out in the world that I've lived in Silicon Valley, tries to shoehorn design into a it's sufficient that we're human-centered. Whether we're using our understanding of human-centered design to design artifacts that are addictive, like vape pens that are addictive, you know, that you can sell very easily to children, which was designed with humans with design thinking, or like the infinite scroll on your Facebook, which is designed to keep you locked in there forever. Those are human-centered design outcomes that are designed without a moral framework.
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, Neil, your challenge is to say, no, that we that's what we have to change, right? This is the shift from a design thinking to a design consciousness. What I want to leave you with is, you know, precisely where we have landed, which is the sense that only certain people can pretend to be objective. They tend to look a certain way. Because they have, you know, at the center of white supremacy is the conviction that being human is being white and male. And so anything that is not that is an aberration to that. And so you basically create this idea of objectivity because it aligns with the way you objectively think about things. And that's the danger, of course, in the court of white supremacy. What's becoming more insidious is the fact that I think, and this is where, again, the religious side of our work needs to be engaged with critically, but also appreciatively, is that I started out saying that the concept of the divine had been that if we go through enlightenment and we begin to understand everything, then now there is no need for God, right? Because we have become everything and we don't need anything else. But that's a very limited understanding of the divine and a very great assumption about who we are. One of the things that we're dealing with is our lack of understanding as a society about the continuing and emanating force of religion. In the 1970s, the Time magazine said, God is dead, we're done, we're moving on, right? Well, that's not happened yet. If we want to try to understand what's happening globally, the number of religious people in the world, the size of the religious population in the world is growing faster, 13 times faster than the non-religious population in the world. You can't tell that because we live, many of us, in Berkeley, right? And so the assumption is that that's not the case. The reality is humans continue to be very motivated by their conviction, by whatever ideas they have about faith. It's not necessarily Christian ideas necessarily, although that's growing in many parts of the world. The part I want us to be attentive to around this is the fact that what is happening then is the understanding of a secular humanism, for example, which is, I think, at the center of what you're saying, Neil, of design thinking understood this way. This is not a critique of anybody who identifies in that way, but is the universalization that the language presumes. That secular humanism is becoming fully human, that if we all grow up to be really smart, then we're going to give up on ideas of the divine. Now, what I want us to be attentive to is who's at the center of that idea. It just so happens that secular humanist ideas match exactly the ideas of white liberals in Berkeley. It's just an exact match. That's just coincidental. It's not really what happens, right? So that's what we have to be critical of. Is that really the case? Is that what it really means to be human? Is to match that particular form of thinking? So our design, our intentionality has to be done this way. The advantage and part of what invites us to try it out, to have fun, to make some mistakes in the tradition is our understandings of both sin and the limits of that, but also of grace. And in terms of iteration, and this is the verse I'll leave you with, is the idea from Lamentations, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. God's mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. In this, there is an oxymoron of a consistent presence of the divine, of a faithfulness that is constantly changing, right? And so that's the idea of iteration, the sense that we can hold this tension between what remains and what is always changing. So thank you for the chance to be with you tonight. Thank you for this great class and great conversation.